On a cold Tuesday night in March 1984, a man named Katsuhisa Ezaki was sitting in a steaming bathtub in his home in Nishinomiya, Japan. He was the 67-year-old president of Glico, a multi-billion-dollar candy company known for its brightly colored boxes of Pocky and Pretz. While he soaked in the hot water, he was unaware that 3 masked men had already cut the telephone lines and broken into his house. They were not there for his money or his jewelry, but for the man who controlled the sugar supply of an entire nation. The paradox of the evening was that the world's most successful candy maker was about to experience the most bitter night of his life. He was a man who spent his days thinking about children's smiles and chocolate coatings. Yet he was being watched through the bathroom door by men holding shotguns and lengths of rope. In less than 10 minutes, the leader of a global corporate empire would be dragged naked from his own home into the freezing night air. This was the start of a campaign of terror that would target the very idea of safety in modern Japan. Welcome to the show. Tonight, we are looking at several cases involving threats that hide in the most familiar places of our daily lives. We have 10 stories in total, starting with a massive corporate extortion plot and moving through mysteries that span the entire globe. You might notice the sound of rain falling outside the window in this recording to help you settle in for these accounts. If you enjoy these types of stories, please consider subscribing to the channel and let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Those who are closest to danger often do not realize it until the door is already open. Before we get into the details of the Glico kidnapping, I have a quick favor to ask regarding the like button. Please invite the like button over for a high-end 5-course dinner and tell them it is a black tie event. When they show up in a tuxedo, greet them at the door wearing only a bathrobe and serve them a single bowl of cold cereal. While they eat in silence, sit across from them and loudly narrate every bite they take into a megaphone. Now, let's get back to the night Katsuhisa Ezaki found out his house was no longer his own. Katsuhisa Ezaki lived a life governed by the clock and the strict social codes of Japanese business. He woke up every morning at 6 o'clock to read the financial papers before being driven to the Glico headquarters in Osaka. His home in Nishinomiya was a symbol of his success, surrounded by a high wall and guarded by a sense of cultural security that few in the West could understand. In Japan in the 1980s, violent crime against high-profile executives was almost non-existent. On the night of March 18th, the Ezaki household was winding down from a typical day of school and business meetings. Katsuhisa had spent the evening with his family, eating a quiet meal and discussing the upcoming spring season. He followed a ritual of taking a long, hot bath every night to clear his head of the day's corporate stresses. The steam filled the room, and the only sound was the light splashing of water against the sides of the deep tub. Inside the house, his wife and children were in their own rooms, preparing for bed. The house was a mix of traditional Japanese architecture and modern convenience, with sliding doors that moved with a soft wooden click. Katsuhisa enjoyed the silence of the late hour because it was the only time he was not being asked for a decision. He was a man who valued order above all else, and his life was a testament to the power of routine. The first sign that something was wrong was not a loud noise, but a subtle change in the atmosphere of the house. He heard the sliding door to the bathroom move, which was unusual because his family knew not to disturb him during his bath. He looked through the steam and saw 2 figures standing in the doorway wearing dark clothing and ski masks. They were holding shotguns and a length of nylon rope, and they did not say a word as they stepped onto the wet floor. Katsuhisa did not scream or splash, but instead sat perfectly still in the water as his brain tried to find a logical explanation. He thought perhaps this was a joke or a strange security drill organized by his staff. The men moved with a clinical efficiency, grabbing his arms and pulling him out of the hot water into the cold air. They bound his hands behind his back and threw a coat over his shoulders, ignoring his quiet questions. While one man kept a shotgun leveled at the CEO, the others went through the house to secure the rest of the family. They tied up his wife and daughter in a separate room, using the same professional knots. They did not search for a safe or demand to see his wallet. which was the first indication that this was not a simple robbery. They were looking for the man himself, and they moved as if they had a map of the house memorized. The kidnappers led Katsuhisa out of the back door and pushed him into the rear of a waiting car. The vehicle sped away from the quiet neighborhood and headed toward an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. He was taken to a cold, damp warehouse that smelled of salt and old machinery. They left him there in the dark, chained to a post, with only a thin blanket to protect him from the concrete floor. The kidnappers sent a ransom note to the Glico headquarters, demanding 1 billion yen and 100 kilograms of gold bullion. This was the largest ransom demand in the history of Japan, and it sent the national police into a state of total panic. They set up checkpoints across the prefecture and began interviewing every known criminal associate in the region. However, the kidnappers seemed to know exactly how the police would respond and stayed one step ahead. 3 days after he was taken, Katsuhisa Izaki managed to do something that surprised both the police and his captors. He noticed that the chain holding him was slightly loose around a rusted pipe in the warehouse. He spent hours rubbing the metal against the pipe until he felt it give way. He slipped his hands free and ran out of the building into the early morning fog, eventually finding a railway worker who called for help. When the police arrived to collect the CEO, they believed the nightmare was finally over because the victim had escaped. Katsuhisa was safe, and the kidnappers had not received a single yen of their massive ransom. They assumed the criminals would go into hiding and wait for the heat to die down. Instead, the escape of the CEO seemed to offend the kidnappers, and they decided to change their tactics entirely. A few weeks later, several Glico office buildings were set on fire in the middle of the night. Shortly after the fires, the company received a letter from a group calling themselves the Monster with 21 Faces. The letter was written in a mocking, informal tone that used a specific Osaka dialect to insult the intelligence of the investigators. They claimed that since they didn't get their money, they were going to play a much more dangerous game. The group began sending letters directly to the Japanese media, turning the entire country into an audience for their crimes. They teased the police by giving them clues about where they would be, only to vanish before the officers arrived. They referred to the police as fools and offered to give them lessons on how to do their jobs. The public began to follow the story like a serialized thriller, unsure of who the monster really was. The situation turned from a corporate prank to a national emergency when the monster sent a new letter with a terrifying claim. They stated that they had placed several boxes of Glico candy in grocery stores that were laced with potassium cyanide. They told the public to look for boxes that had a small sticker saying that the contents were dangerous. Panic swept through Japan, and Glico was forced to pull every single product from the shelves of every store in the country. The financial impact on the company was devastating, as millions of boxes of chocolate were destroyed in massive heaps. Glico's stock price plummeted, and thousands of workers were laid off as production lines ground to a halt. The monster seemed to enjoy the destruction of the company more than they had wanted the original ransom. They were not just criminals, they were psychological terrorists who wanted to see a giant crumble. The police investigation became the largest in the history of the country, involving over 1 million officers over the course of the case. They began watching grocery stores around the clock, hoping to catch someone placing a poisoned box on a shelf. During one of these stings, a patrolman spotted a man in a grocery store wearing a baseball cap and a light jacket. The man had very distinctive, slanted eyes that the officer later described as fox-like. The fox-eyed man noticed the officer watching him and began to walk calmly toward the exit of the store. The officer followed him into a crowded train station, trying to stay close without alerting the suspect. However, the man seemed to move through the crowd with an impossible grace, slipping behind a pillar and disappearing. This man would become the primary face of the mystery, but he was never seen long enough to be identified. The monster then expanded their target list to include other major food companies like Morinaga and House Foods. They used the same tactics, demanding money and threatening to poison the food supply of the nation. They were playing with the entire economy of Japan. proving that they could bring any corporation to its knees with a single postage stamp. The police were under immense pressure from the government to produce a suspect. In August of 1985, a police superintendent named Shoji Kondo reached his breaking point. He was the head of the Shiga Prefecture Police and felt the personal shame of failing to capture the fox-eyed man during a botched drop-off. Unable to live with the perceived dishonor of his failure, he went into his backyard and set himself on fire. His death was a somber reminder of how much the monster had managed to damage the fabric of Japanese society. A few days after the superintendent's suicide, the monster with 21 faces sent one final letter to the media. They expressed a strange kind of respect for the man who had died, stating that his death was the only thing that had moved them. They wrote that they were tired of bullying companies and that they had decided to retire. The letter ended with the phrase, "We are bad guys," which means we have more to do than bullying companies. True to their word, the letters stopped arriving, and no more poisoned candy was ever found in the stores. The group simply stopped existing as suddenly as they had appeared. There were no more fires, no more ransom demands, and no more sightings of the fox-eyed man. The Japanese police continued to work the case for another 15 years, following thousands of leads that led to nothing. Investigators looked into every possible theory, from disgruntled former employees to North Korean spies. They wondered if the group was a secret union of food workers who were angry about automation in the factories. Some believed it was a group of investors who wanted to short the stock of the companies they were attacking. Each theory had merit, but none of them could account for the sheer level of sophisticated planning the group displayed. The case of the monster with 21 faces remains the most famous unsolved mystery in the history of Japan. The statute of limitations for the kidnapping and the extortion officially expired in the year 2000. This means that even if the members of the group walked into a police station today and confessed, they could not be prosecuted. They successfully committed a crime that paralyzed a nation and then walked away with the secret of their identity. The Glico company eventually recovered and returned to its position as a global leader in the snack industry. However, the security protocols in Japanese corporate life were changed forever because of those 17 months of terror. The hot bath that Katsuhisa Izaki took that night in March was the last time he ever felt truly safe in his own home. He lived the rest of his life knowing that somewhere in the crowd, someone was still watching with fox-like eyes. The final verdict on this case is one of total silence from the perpetrators. They proved that a small group of people could defeat 1 million police officers through the use of psychological warfare and media manipulation. They didn't need the billion yen to win. They just needed to prove that the authorities were powerless to stop them. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing about a monster is not what it does, but that it can choose when to stop. The legacy of the Glico-Morinaga case is a cold reminder that the things we consume every day are vulnerable to those who want to do harm. It shows that the structure of a high-trust society can be turned against itself by those who understand its rules. While the Glico case involved a public battle for control of a nation's food, our next story takes us to the private shadows of a family home in Argentina. There, the threat was not a mysterious group in the media, but a father who turned his own basement into a prison. In the winter of 1982, Alejandro Puccio was walking down a quiet street in San Isidro, Argentina, carrying his mud-stained rugby boots. The air was damp and smelled of wood smoke from the surrounding upscale villas. He was a 23-year-old star player for the Cassie Rugby Club, known for his speed and his calm demeanor under pressure. Every evening followed the same rhythm of training sessions and family dinners in their large white house. His father, Archimedes, was usually waiting in the study, surrounded by stacks of newspapers and legal documents. The house functioned like a well-oiled machine, with his mother preparing large meals and his younger siblings finishing their school assignments at the kitchen table. Alejandro was the pride of the family, a national hero who represented the strength and future of Argentina. He spent at least 3 hours every day practicing his kicking until his legs felt like lead. The neighborhood of San Isidro was a place where people felt insulated from the political chaos of the city. High stone walls and iron gates protected the manicured lawns and the expensive cars parked in the driveways. Everyone knew the Puccio family as a pillar of the community, the kind of people who never missed a Sunday service. They were the embodiment of traditional values in a country that was slowly trying to find its way back to stability. Alejandro had a specific habit of checking the air pressure in his rugby balls every night before he went to bed. He had a plan to play for the national team in the upcoming world tour, a dream that seemed within his reach. On his dresser sat a small wooden box where he kept his spare laces and a lucky silver coin. These small details of his life were fixed and unchanging, providing a sense of permanence in an uncertain world. The house was always filled with the comforting sounds of a busy household, like the hum of the refrigerator and the television playing in the background. In the evenings, the scent of slow-roasted beef would drift from the kitchen through the hallways. The light in the foyer was soft and yellow, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. It was a space designed for comfort and the quiet celebration of a life well lived. The first sign of a shift occurred when Alejandro was asked to help his father with a small errand involving a family friend named Ricardo Manukian. Ricardo was a wealthy young man who moved in the same social circles as the rugby team. Archimedes explained that they needed to discuss a business matter in private at the house. There was nothing unusual about a father asking his son for a favor, yet the request felt strangely heavy in the cold night air. Alejandro drove his car to a prearranged spot and waited for Ricardo to appear on the sidewalk. He waved his friend over, and Ricardo climbed into the passenger seat with a smile, expecting a short ride to a meeting. As they pulled away from the curb, Archimedes and two other men appeared from the shadows in the back seat. This was the moment the internal logic of Alejandro's world began to fracture beyond repair. He continued to drive toward his family home while his father held a weapon to the side of their friend's head. The streets of San Isidro looked exactly the same as they had 10 minutes earlier, but the air inside the car had become thick and suffocating. Alejandro realized that his role in the family was changing from a protector to something far darker. He pulled the car into the driveway and waited for the gate to click shut behind them. They led Ricardo into the house, but they did not go to the study or the dining room where the rest of the family was gathered. Instead, they moved toward a heavy wooden door that led to a storage area in the basement. Alejandro could hear his sisters laughing in the kitchen as they cleared the dinner plates. The sound of domestic normalcy was a sharp contrast to the cold metal of the chains his father was now retrieving from a shelf. For the next few weeks, the Puccio household maintained a double existence that defied common sense. Upstairs, the family ate breakfast and discussed Alejandro's upcoming rugby matches with the local press. Downstairs, Ricardo was chained to a wall in a room that had been soundproofed with heavy blankets and wood panels. The screams of the prisoner were muffled by the loud music that Archimedes played on a record player in the hallway. Alejandro found himself sitting in his room, staring at his rugby trophies while the reality of the situation settled into his bones. He wondered if his mother knew about the man in the basement, or if she simply chose not to ask about the extra portions of food. He told himself that his father was protecting the family interests and that everything would return to normal soon. It was a fragile lie that he repeated until it started to sound like the truth. The kidnapping of Ricardo Manukian was followed by a ransom demand of $500,000 sent to his wealthy family. The Puccios waited for the payment with a clinical patience, as if they were waiting for a business investment to mature. When the money was eventually delivered to a drop-off point, the family did not release their friend. They drove him to a remote field and ended his life to ensure there would be no witnesses. The police investigation into the disappearance of the young businessman initially focused on political groups and professional kidnapping rings. Argentina was transitioning from a military dictatorship, and rogue intelligence officers were known to be active in the shadows. No one suspected the star rugby player and his respectable father, who lived in the heart of San Isidro. The investigators looked everywhere except at the White House, with the well-kept garden. The success of the first kidnapping emboldened Archimedes to expand his operations over the next 3 years. They targeted more people they knew, including another businessman named Eduardo Aulet, and later an engineer named Emilio Naum. Each time, the process was the same: a friendly approach by Alejandro followed by a violent abduction. The basement was rarely empty, yet the family's social standing continued to rise. During this period, Alejandro continued to play rugby at the highest level, often appearing on the front pages of national sports magazines. He would come home from a stadium filled with cheering fans and walk past a locked door where a human being was being held for ransom. The psychological wall he built between his two lives was thick enough to block out the guilt. He was a hero in the sunlight and a jailer in the dark. The third victim, Emilio Naum, fought back during the abduction and was shot dead in the middle of a busy street. This was a significant error that brought intense heat to the investigation and forced the family to be more cautious. However, the greed of the patriarch was stronger than his fear of the authorities. Archimedes decided they needed one more big score before they could retire from their secret trade. In August of 1985, they kidnapped a woman named Nelida Bolini de Prado and kept her in the basement for 32 days. By this time, the new democratic government had reorganized the police force and began using more advanced surveillance techniques. They started tracking the phone calls made by the kidnappers and noticed a pattern that led back to a specific block in San Isidro. The net was slowly closing around the most respected family in the neighborhood. On a humid evening in late August, the elite tactical units of the police moved into position around the Pucho residence. They waited for the moment when the family was most relaxed. Sitting together in the living room after a long day, the front door was smashed open, and officers flooded the hallways with weapons drawn. They moved through the house with a speed that left the family members frozen in their seats. The officers found the hidden door in the basement and discovered Nelida Bolini de Prado alive, chained to a mattress in a small, windowless room. The smell of the space was overwhelming, a mix of unwashed bodies and the stale scent of fear. Upstairs, they found the ransom notes and the ledgers where Archimedes had meticulously recorded the payments from previous victims. The double life of the Puccio family was laid bare on the kitchen counter. Alejandro attempted to end his own life by jumping from the 5th floor of the courthouse during his initial hearing. He survived the fall, but was left with permanent injuries that served as a daily reminder of his choices. The public was stunned to learn that their favorite athlete had been a key participant in such a cold-blooded enterprise. The trial revealed that the entire family had played a role, from providing food to keeping watch. The twist in the story was not that a criminal had used his family as a cover, but that the family had used their normalcy as a weapon. They didn't just kidnap strangers. They kidnapped people they had invited over for dinner and played sports with. The victims had looked into the eyes of a friend and saw only a cold calculation for profit. Every smile Alejandro gave to a fan was a mask for the horror he left behind in the basement. The court sentenced Archimedes and Alejandro to life imprisonment for their roles in the multiple kidnappings and murders. The mother and daughters were also charged, though their sentences were lighter, as they claimed they were acting under the father's absolute authority. The White House in San Isidro became a local landmark of infamy, a place where people would walk on the opposite side of the street. It stood as a silent witness to the years of suffering that occurred behind its walls. Archimedes Puccio died in 2013 while living in a small town after being released on parole. He never expressed remorse for his actions and died alone, as no one from his family or community would claim his body. Alejandro passed away in 2008 from complications related to his health and his previous suicide attempt. The fame he once had was replaced by a legacy of betrayal and the memory of the chains in the basement. The final verdict on the Puccio family is that they represent the ultimate failure of trust in a community. They prove that a monster does not need a cave or a dark forest when it can hide in a suburban dining room. The victims were not taken by a mysterious force, but by the very people they considered their neighbors. We are often told to look for danger in the shadows, but the Puccios showed that it can stand right in the light. The sound of the gate clicking shut in San Isidro was the last thing many people heard before their lives were traded for a stack of bills. The artifacts of Alejandro's rugby career were eventually lost or thrown away, leaving only the court records and the photographs of the basement. The tragedy of the case is that the normalcy was not a mask, but a part of the crime itself. Some people can live two lives and never feel the weight of the second one. Moving from the suburban horror of Argentina, we traveled to the old world and the picturesque hills of Italy. There, the shadows were not found in a basement, but in the dense woods surrounding the city of Florence. A predator was waiting in the tall grass for young couples who thought they were alone under the moon. This killer would leave a signature so precise it suggested a dark intent that went far beyond simple violence. In June of 1981, the hills of Tuscany were thick with the scent of blooming ginestra and the sound of crickets. Carmela Denuccio was a 21-year-old woman who worked in a local leather factory in the town of Scandicci. She had spent the afternoon preparing for a date with her boyfriend, Giovanni Foggi, who was 30 years old and worked for the National Railway. They lived in a culture where young couples had very little privacy at home, so they often spent their evenings driving into the countryside for a few hours of quiet. Giovanni owned a small, cream-colored Fiat 127 that he kept in perfect condition. He had a habit of cleaning the dashboard every Sunday afternoon while listening to the radio. On this particular Saturday night, he picked up Carmela from her parents' house at exactly 9 o'clock. She was wearing a new floral dress and a gold necklace that her mother had given her for her birthday. The couple drove toward a secluded area known as the Bartoline Hills, a place popular with young lovers looking for a view of the stars. The road was narrow and winding, lined with tall cypress trees that blocked out the light from the valley below. Giovanni found a spot near a vineyard where the grass was long and the shadows were deep. He turned off the engine and the headlights, letting the silence of the night settle around the car. They sat in the small cabin of the Fiat, talking about their plans for a summer vacation at the coast. Carmela had already started a small savings account specifically for a new bathing suit and a train ticket to Rimini. She liked the way the moonlight caught the silver trim on the car's door handle. It was a typical night for thousands of people across Italy, defined by the simple desire for a few hours of companionship. The temperature outside was 72 degrees, but a light breeze made the pine needles rustle against the roof of the car. Giovanni had left the driver's side window cracked an inch to let in the cool air. The only other sound was the ticking of the car's engine as it cooled down in the grass. Carmela leaned back against the seat, watching the silhouettes of the trees against the pale gray sky. She noticed that a bird had stopped singing in the nearby thicket, leaving the silence feeling slightly heavier than before. A small pebble skittered across the asphalt of the road, a few yards behind the car. Giovanni did not seem to hear it, as he was busy adjusting the volume on the small tape deck. Carmela assumed it was just a fox or a stray cat moving through the brush. A few minutes later, the light from the moon was momentarily blocked by something passing between the car and the tree line. It was a quick, fluid motion that looked like a cloud moving across the sky. But there were no clouds that night. Carmela looked into the rearview mirror and saw a faint reflection of something metallic in the darkness. She told herself it was just the light hitting a discarded tin can in the grass. The air inside the car suddenly felt much colder as a shadow fell directly across the front windshield. Giovanni looked up and reached for the key in the ignition, but he was not fast enough. A single flash of light erupted from the darkness outside the passenger window. The sound of the glass shattering was the only warning they received before the night turned into a scene of clinical precision. A Beretta 22 caliber pistol fired 5 rounds into the car in less than 3 seconds. Giovanni was hit in the head and neck, ending his movements before he could pull the lever for the headlights. Carmela screamed and tried to open the door, but the lock was jammed from the impact of the bullets. She saw a figure standing just outside the broken glass, wearing a dark jacket and holding a flashlight. The figure did not speak or move with any sense of urgency. He reached through the broken window and opened the door from the inside with a steady hand. He pulled Carmela out of the car and dragged her across the grass toward a small clearing near the edge of the vineyard. She tried to fight back, but the man used the heavy frame of the pistol to silence her resistance. What happened next in the darkness of Scandicci would change the history of Italian criminal investigation. The man did not simply leave the scene after the double murder. He produced a sharp, surgical blade from his pocket and began to work on Carmela's body. He moved with the confidence of someone who had studied anatomy or had spent years working in a professional kitchen. He removed a specific section of the victim's pubic area with 3 clean, curved incisions. There was no sign of hesitation or jagged edges in the wounds left behind. He took the tissue as a trophy and placed it in a container before disappearing back into the woods. The entire event took less than 15 minutes from the first shot to the final departure. The bodies were discovered the next morning by a local farmer who was checking his vines. He found the cream-colored Fiat with its doors wide open and the interior covered in fine glass dust. Giovanni was still slumped over the steering wheel, his hand frozen near the ignition. Carmela was found several yards away, positioned in a way that made her injuries visible to anyone who approached. The Carabinieri arrived at the scene and immediately noted the similarities to a crime that had occurred 7 years earlier. In 1974, another couple had been murdered in a parked car with the same type of weapon. The investigator in charge, Silvia della Monica, realized they were looking at a serial offender who had returned from a long silence. They began to call the killer the Monster of Florence. Ballistics experts confirmed that the bullets used were Winchester Series H, which were rare and had a specific copper coating. The shell casings found at the scene matched those from the 1974 murder and even a crime from 1968. This meant the same Beretta pistol had been used across 3 different decades. The police realized the killer was someone who had been operating in the shadows for over 12 years. The first major lead in the investigation focused on a man named Stefano Mele, who had been convicted of the 1968 murder. However, Mele was in prison when the murders in 1974 and 1981 took place. This suggested that either the wrong man was in jail or that the pistol was being passed between members of a secret group. The theory of a single, lone wolf killer began to lose ground to something much more complex. 4 months later, in October of 1981, the monster struck again in a town called Calanzano. Stefano Baldi and Pasquia Cambi were found murdered in their car near an abandoned farmhouse. The killer used the same Beretta pistol and performed the same surgical excision on the female victim. The precision of the cuts was even more refined than the previous time, showing a high level of practice. The police received thousands of tips about suspicious men seen in the woods at night. Witnesses reported seeing a red car parked near the crime scenes and a man with a distinct limp walking along the roadside. They interviewed local woodsmen, butchers, and doctors, searching for anyone with the skills to use a scalpel in total darkness. The hills of Florence became a place of paranoia, and young couples stopped going out after sunset. One persistent theory suggested that the killer was a man known as the First Woodman. This was a person who knew every trail and hidden clearing in the Tuscan countryside. He could move through the brush without making a sound and could navigate the steep terrain during the new moon. The investigators believed the killer specifically chose nights with no moonlight to hide his movements from potential witnesses. In the 1990s, the investigation shifted toward a local farmer named Pietro Pacciani. He was a man with a history of violence and a deep knowledge of the area surrounding Scandicci. Pacciani was eventually convicted of the murders, but the verdict was later overturned on appeal. He died before a second trial could be completed, leaving the identity of the monster officially in question. The twist in the case came from a second level of investigation involving a group called the Snack Bar Buddies. These were a group of marginalized men who spent their time in local bars and were seen near several of the crime scenes. One member of the group claimed that they were not the masterminds, but were being paid by a higher social circle. They alleged that a group of wealthy individuals were ordering the biological trophies for occult rituals. This theory reinterpreted the surgical precision of the wounds not as a sign of a lone madman, but as the requirements of a customer It suggested that the man in the woods was merely a provider for a secret society that met in the private villas of Florence. The Beretta pistol was the common thread that linked these different worlds together. If this was true, the real killers were people who sat in the front rows of the local churches and opera houses. Despite decades of trials and thousands of pages of evidence, the Beretta 22 has never been found. The gun that ended the lives of 16 people across 14 years remains hidden somewhere in the Italian soil. The files on the Monster of Florence are still open, but the physical evidence has been degraded by time and poor handling. The families of the victims are left with a resolution that feels as hollow as the silence in the woods. The hills of Scandicci are still beautiful, and the vineyards continue to produce some of the finest wine in the world. But for those who remember 1981, the darkness under the trees carries a different meaning. They know that the most clinical evil does not always leave a name behind. It only leaves a signature and a void that can never be filled by a court ruling. The final verdict is that the Monster of Florence was more than a man. He was a shadow that exposed the failures of a justice system. The surgical precision of his crimes suggested a level of skill that was never matched with a face. He turned the romantic landscape of Tuscany into a map of cold, calculated violence. Even today, some people avoid the secluded paths when the moon is new and the wind is high. Carmela Danuccio's gold necklace was never found, and her plans for the summer trip to the coast were buried with her. The small cream-colored Fiat was eventually sold for scrap metal, its history of violence washed away by the rain. The case remains a labyrinth of dead ends and secret associations that lead nowhere. Some secrets are kept not by the person who committed the act, but by the silence of the woods that witnessed it. The Italian authorities eventually officially closed the case after the primary suspects passed away. This decision was met with anger by independent researchers who believed the circle of shadows was never fully explored. They argue that the focus on Pacciani was a distraction from the more powerful figures involved. The truth remains buried in the files of the Anti-Monster Squad, protected by the passage of time. There is a small memorial near the vineyard in Scandicci, often covered by tall grass and wildflowers. It serves as a reminder that the hills were once a hunting ground for a man with a scalpel and a gun. Most people drive past it without knowing the significance of the small stone marker. But the crickets still go silent when a shadow moves through the trees at the wrong time of night. Moving away from the moonlit hills of Italy, we traveled to the rain-soaked valleys of eastern France. There, a different kind of predator was watching a young family from the distance. This threat did not use a pistol or a blade, but a pen and a telephone to tear a community apart. The target was a 4-year-old boy whose disappearance would trigger a decades-long war of words and blood. In the early spring of 1985, a ranch hand named Manuel was walking along the perimeter fence of the Santa Elena Ranch in Matamoros, Mexico. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, turning the dusty landscape into a deep shade of purple. He was carrying a heavy coil of barbed wire and a pair of rusted pliers to fix a section of the fence that had been knocked down by a stray bull. Manuel was 26 years old, with skin that had been toughened by a decade of working under the harsh border sun. He took pride in the physical nature of his work and the quiet solitude of the desert at night. His routine was predictable, consisting of 12 hours of labor, followed by a simple meal and a few hours of sleep in a small shack. The ranch had recently become much busier than usual due to the arrival of several new men from the city. These men drove expensive trucks and carried automatic weapons, but they were not there to help with the cattle. Manuel tried to stay out of their way, focusing instead on the daily needs of the livestock and the maintenance of the property. He had a specific habit of checking the water troughs at exactly 7 o'clock every evening. He was saving every peso he earned to buy a small plot of land near the coast for his elderly mother. He kept his savings in an old coffee tin hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his room. The air at the ranch always smelled of dry manure and the diesel fumes from the passing trucks on the nearby highway. He liked the sound of the wind whistling through the scrub brush and the way the stars looked when there was no moon. It was a simple, honest life that felt disconnected from the violence of the drug trade across the border. The first sign of a shift in the ranch's atmosphere was the discovery of a small, windowless shack at the edge of the property. Manuel noticed that the new men were spending a lot of time there, carrying heavy bags and large containers inside. He saw a pile of fresh dirt nearby that suggested they were digging something deep into the ground. One evening, he found a heavy iron cauldron sitting in the center of the shack when the door had been left slightly ajar. The smell coming from the vessel was a sickening mix of rotting meat and metallic copper. He looked inside and saw several large sticks and what appeared to be animal bones resting in a dark, thick liquid. Manuel told himself that the men were likely practitioners of a local folk religion and that the cauldron was used for traditional blessings. He did not want to cause trouble with his employers, so he closed the door and continued with his evening chores. He believed that as long as he did his job, the strange activities in the shack would not affect him. The point of no return occurred when he saw a young man being led from the back of a truck toward the small shack. The young man was not a ranch hand or a drug runner, and his hands were bound tightly behind his back with rope. Manuel watched from the shadows of the barn as Adolfo Constanzo, the leader of the group, stepped into the light. Constanzo was a tall man with a charismatic presence who everyone at the ranch called the Padrino. He spoke to his followers in a low, confident voice, telling them that they were about to perform a ceremony of great power. Manuel felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he realized the young man was not there to talk. The logic of the ranch had completely shifted from a place of agriculture to a theater for something much darker. Manuel watched as Constanzo explained that a human sacrifice was necessary to make the group's drug shipments invisible to the police. He claimed that the spirit of the victim would enter the iron cauldron and serve as a supernatural shield. There was no path for escape for the young man, as the perimeter of the ranch was guarded by armed men who were completely loyal to the Padrino. Manuel realized that he was witnessing a ritual that defied everything he understood about the world. He stood paralyzed in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic chanting coming from inside the shack. The group began to believe that they were becoming invincible because their drug shipments were crossing the border without a single arrest. They credited the power of the iron cauldron for their success and became even more devoted to Constanzo's teachings. The ranch became a place where the line between religious devotion and criminal activity disappeared. Manuel found himself in a position where he had to decide whether to stay silent or risk his life by talking to the authorities. He knew that the local police were often on the payroll of the drug cartels and might report him back to the group. He chose to keep his head down and focus on the cattle, trying to block out the sounds from the shack. The escalation continued throughout 1985 as more people began to vanish from the border region. The group was no longer just sacrificing rival gang members, but was taking anyone who they felt would add power to their cauldron. The ranch was becoming a graveyard for the innocent, all in the name of a dark and twisted magic. Constanzo told his followers that they were now bulletproof and that no weapon formed against them could cause harm. He encouraged them to take greater risks in their business dealings, confident in their supernatural protection. The cult members began to walk with a sense of arrogance that made them stand out to the local community. The investigation into the disappearances was slow and disorganized due to the corruption within the local police departments. Many officers were afraid to investigate the Hernandez family or anyone associated with Adolfo Constanzo. They wrote off the missing persons as simple border crossings or people who had moved away for work. The first major break in the case did not come from a detective's lead, but from a mistake made by a cult member at a checkpoint. A man named Elio Hernandez drove through a police roadblock without stopping, believing that his magic would keep him from being noticed. The officers gave chase and eventually searched his truck, finding traces of blood and several suspicious items. This arrest led the police to the Santa Elena Ranch, where they expected to find a typical drug processing facility. They were not prepared for the scene that awaited them in the small shack at the edge of the property. When they opened the door, the smell of death was so strong that several officers had to step back into the fresh air. They found the iron cauldron, which was now filled with human remains and various ritual objects. The police discovered over a dozen bodies, buried in shallow graves around the perimeter of the shack. Each victim had been treated with the same level of calculated cruelty as part of the Padrino's rituals. The twist in the story came when the police realized that the cult members truly believed in their own invincibility. During the final raids, many of the group members stood their ground against armed officers, refusing to take cover or surrender. They were convinced that the bullets would pass right through them because of the sacrifices they had made. This meant that the magic was not just a scam to take their money, but a total psychological takeover of their survival instincts. Constanzo had managed to convince a group of hardened criminals that they were gods walking among men. They died holding on to a lie that had been reinforced by every drop of blood they spilled into the cauldron. The final verdict on the Matamoros cult was one of total destruction for everyone involved. Adolfo Constanzo died in a shootout with police in Mexico City in 1989 after his empire collapsed. His high priestess, Sara Aldrete, was captured and remains in a prison cell today, serving a sentence of several decades. The Santa Elena Ranch was eventually seized by the government, and the buildings were razed to the ground. The cattle were sold off, and the dusty landscape slowly reclaimed the space where the rituals had taken place. Manuel disappeared from the area shortly after the first arrests, taking his coffee tin of savings and leaving the border behind. The graves are still marked by simple wooden crosses that the locals put up to honor the unidentified victims. They serve as a reminder of the darkness that can take hold when power is mixed with a total disregard for human life. The iron cauldron is kept in a police evidence locker, a heavy and silent artifact of a time when the desert was filled with ghosts. Adolfo Constanzo's belief in his own power was so absolute that he ordered his own followers to shoot him rather than let him be captured. He died believing he was transitioning to another world where he would continue his reign. The tragedy of the case is that his victims were given no such choice in their final moments. Some secrets are so dark that the ground itself seems to remember them long after the players are gone. The story of the Matamoros cult is a reminder that the most dangerous weapon is not a gun or a blade, but a corrupted belief system. It shows that people will follow a leader into the abyss if they are promised a seat at the table of power. The final count of the victims is likely much higher than the 15 bodies that were officially recovered from the ranch. Many of those who vanished in the border region during the mid-80s were never found or identified. They remain names on a list of missing persons, lost in the shadows of the Padrino's dark empire. The air at the site of the ranch still feels different to those who know its history. They say that the wind carries a faint sound of chanting when the night is still and the moon is hidden. But most people prefer to forget that such things could happen in a place that looked so ordinary from the road. Moving from the supernatural delusions of a desert cult, we travel to the quiet villages of eastern France. There, the threat was not a group of armed men, but a single anonymous voice that claimed to know everything. This person used the mail and the telephone to wage a war against a young family who only wanted to be left alone. In October of 1984, Jean-Marie Villemain was standing on the factory floor in the Vosges region of eastern France, listening to the rhythmic grinding of industrial machinery. He was a 30-year-old foreman who had recently been promoted, a position that brought him both a higher salary and the quiet resentment of his co-workers. He spent his days overseeing the production of textiles, making sure every loom was running at maximum efficiency. At exactly 5 o'clock, he would clock out and drive his dark sedan back to the small village of Lepanges-sur-Vallon. His home was a modern, two-story house situated on a hill overlooking the valley, a clear sign of his rising social status in a community where many families struggled to get by. Jean-Marie took great pride in the manicured lawn and the bright white shutters that he painted himself every spring. Inside, his wife Christine was usually preparing dinner while their 4-year-old son, Gregory, played with his toy cars on the rug. The house was filled with the scent of lavender cleaner and the sound of the evening news on the television. Jean-Marie had a specific habit of checking the mailbox at the end of the driveway before he even turned off the car engine. He was meticulous about his finances, keeping every receipt and invoice organized in a series of blue folders in his home office. He had a plan to save enough money to take the family on a trip to the Mediterranean the following summer. These small, orderly details defined his existence and gave him a sense of control over his future in the tight-knit mountain community. The village of Lapanges was a place where everyone was related by blood or by decades of shared history in the local mills. The air always felt damp and carried the smell of pine needles and wood smoke from the surrounding forests. In the evenings, the fog would roll down from the mountains and settle over the Valon River, turning the landscape into a series of gray silhouettes. It was a beautiful, claustrophobic environment where secrets were kept as carefully as family heirlooms. The first sign that the Villemin family was being watched occurred 2 years earlier when the telephone began to ring at odd hours of the night. Jean-Marie would answer only to hear a distorted, gravelly voice on the other end, breathing heavily or whispering insults. The caller seemed to know intimate details about the family's daily schedule and their private conversations. This anonymous harasser became known in the village as Le Corbeau, or the Crow, a term used in France for someone who writes poison pen letters. Jean-Marie initially believed the calls were a prank played by a jealous neighbor or a disgruntled worker at the factory. He told himself that if he ignored the harassment, the caller would eventually grow bored and move on to someone else. He recorded the dates and times of the calls in a notebook, trying to find a pattern in the chaos. The Crow continued to strike with a clinical persistence, sending letters that mocked Jean-Marie's promotion and his growing wealth. One afternoon in 1983, a letter arrived that contained a specific threat against the safety of little Gregory. The handwriting was slanted and cramped, filling the page with a sense of barely contained rage. Jean-Marie installed new locks on the doors and instructed Christine to never leave the boy unattended in the yard. He started carrying a heavy wooden club in his car, his eyes scanning the tree line every time he pulled into the driveway. The point of no return arrived on the 16th of October, 1984, a day that began with a cold drizzle and a low-hanging mist. Jean-Marie was at work when Christine called the factory in a state of total panic to say that Gregory was missing from the front yard. He had been playing in a pile of sand while his mother was inside the house for less than 10 minutes. By the time Jean-Marie reached the house, the police were already searching the nearby woods and the banks of the river. At 5:30 that evening, Jean-Marie's brother received a phone call from the Crow, who spoke with a chilling sense of triumph. The caller stated that he had taken his revenge on the foreman and that the body would be found in the Valone River. The voice was calm and precise, providing a location near a bridge a few kilometers away from the village. The search teams moved toward the water, their flashlights cutting through the thick evening fog. The police found Gregory's body tied up with nylon ropes, his hands and feet bound together in a way that suggested a ritualistic level of care. He was still wearing his blue wool hat and his tiny leather shoes, looking as if he had simply fallen asleep in the cold water. There were no signs of a struggle or physical violence, only the overwhelming evidence of a planned execution. The next morning, a letter arrived in the mail addressed to Jean-Marie, stating that the debt had been paid. The investigation into the murder turned the village of Lapanges into a battlefield of accusations and ancient family grudges. The police focused their attention on the Villemins' extended family, believing that only someone with a deep knowledge of their history could be the Crow. They looked at Jean-Marie's cousins and siblings, searching for the source of the resentment that had led to the river. The case became a national obsession, with reporters from Paris crowding the narrow streets of the village. The first primary suspect was Bernard Laroche, a cousin of Jean-Marie who worked at a nearby factory and had a history of tension with the family. A witness claimed to have seen a man matching Laroche's description driving a green car near the bridge on the afternoon of the murder. Handwriting experts analyzed thousands of samples, trying to match the cramped script of the letters to Laroche's natural hand. He was arrested and held in custody, but the evidence against him remained frustratingly circumstantial. Jean-Marie spent his days sitting in his darkened living room, staring at the empty rug where his son used to play. He watched the news reports and read the transcripts of the police interviews, his mind fixated on the idea of justice. He felt that the legal system was moving too slowly and that the suspect would eventually be released on a technicality. The order and logic that had governed his life were replaced by a cold, singular focus on the man he believed killed his child. When Bernard Laroche was eventually released from prison due to a lack of physical evidence, Jean-Marie decided to take the law into his own hands. He drove to Laroche's house and waited in the shadows of the driveway with a loaded shotgun. When the cousin arrived home from work, Jean-Marie stepped into the light and fired a single shot at close range. He then called the police himself and waited on the curb for them to arrive and take him away. The murder of the primary suspect did not end the mystery, but instead made the search for the crow even more complicated. The investigation shifted toward Jean-Marie's wife, Christine. After some experts claimed her handwriting matched the letters sent by the harasser, she was accused of killing her own son to frame the family members she hated, a theory that split the country into two opposing camps. She spent years fighting to clear her name, while her husband remained behind bars for the shooting. The twist in the case was revealed years later when advanced forensic testing showed that the DNA on the ropes was hopelessly contaminated. The police had failed to secure the crime scene or the evidence, allowing dozens of people to touch the items before they were analyzed. This meant that the one piece of physical evidence that could have identified the killer was rendered useless. The crow remained a ghost, hidden behind the wall of silence that the village had built around itself. In 2017, the case was reopened using new technology that allows for the analysis of minute traces of DNA and voice recordings. Several family members were detained and questioned, but no new charges were brought forward that could stand up in court. The people of Lepanges continue to live in the shadow of the 1984 murder, knowing that the killer is likely still among them. They pass each other in the grocery store and at church, never acknowledging the secret that they all share. The final verdict on the murder of Gregory Villemin is that the truth was sacrificed to the petty jealousies of a small town. The anonymous letters and the phone calls succeeded in destroying the family more effectively than any physical weapon ever could. Jean-Marie and Christine eventually moved away from the Vosges, trying to find a life where the name of their son was not a headline. They left behind a house that remains a monument to a revenge that no one can fully explain. The Valon River still flows through the valley, cold and gray under the mountain mist. The bridge where the boy was found is a quiet place, used mostly by farmers and the occasional tourist who knows the history of the area. Most people do not linger there, as the atmosphere remains heavy with the weight of the unsolved crime. Some secrets are so heavy they can sink an entire family to the bottom of a cold river. Jean-Marie served his time in prison and was eventually released, but he remains a man defined by the loss of his son and the act of violence he committed in response. He no longer keeps the meticulous blue folders or plans for summer vacations by the sea. He lives a quiet, anonymous life, far away from the factory and the white shutters of his old home. The sound of a ringing telephone is something he still refuses to answer after the sun goes down. Moving from the rain-soaked valleys of France, we travel to the vast, red desert of Central Australia. There, another family was enjoying a quiet camping trip under the shadow of a massive rock monolith. They were far away from the jealousies of a small village, believing they were safe in the isolation of the outback. But a different kind of predator was watching their tent from the darkness, leading to a mystery that would capture the attention of an entire continent. On the evening of August 17, 1980, Lindy Chamberlain was standing near a portable barbecue grill at a campsite at the base of Uluru in Central Australia. The sun had recently set, leaving the massive red monolith glowing with a fading, orange light that felt both beautiful and oppressive. Lindy was a 32-year-old mother of three who had traveled from Queensland with her husband, Michael, for a much-needed family vacation. She spent the final minutes of the twilight cleaning up the remnants of their dinner while her 9-week-old daughter, Azariya, slept in a tent just a few yards away. Lindy was a person who lived her life according to a strict set of internal and religious values as a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, a specific pattern of preparing breakfast, hiking the base of the rock, and ensuring her children were protected from the harsh desert sun. She had a plan to finish the camping loop and return home to start a new garden in their backyard the following week. She had a specific habit of checking the temperature of the baby's milk with a thermometer every time she prepared a bottle. On this trip, she kept her nursing supplies in a yellow plastic bin that was organized by size and frequency of use. She also carried a small notebook where she recorded the local flora they encountered on their daily walks. These small, meticulous actions gave her a sense of control in an environment that was vast and inherently unpredictable. The campsite was a small clearing of red dirt surrounded by low scrub brush and the endless silence of the outback. The air always smelled of dry earth and the faint, sweet scent of burning eucalyptus wood from the communal fire pit. In the evenings, the temperature would drop rapidly, forcing the campers to put on heavy sweaters and retreat toward the warmth of their lanterns. It was a place where the barrier between civilization and the wild was as thin as the canvas of a tent. The first sign of a physical shift in the environment occurred when Lindy noticed a dingo standing near the edge of the light from their campfire. It was a lean, sandy-colored animal that watched the family with a steady, unblinking gaze before disappearing into the shadows. Lindy had seen dingoes earlier in the week and had been told by park rangers that they were generally harmless scavengers. She noted the animal's presence and then continued with her task of drying the plastic plates from dinner. A few minutes later, she heard a sharp, brief cry coming from inside the tent where Azaria was sleeping. It was a sound that every parent recognizes. A sudden wakefulness that usually requires only a quick, comforting hand or a bottle. Lindy walked toward the tent, expecting to see her daughter moving under the blankets in the dim light of the lantern. She told herself that the baby had likely been startled by the sound of a passing breeze or the movement of her older brothers in the next sleeping bag. The point of no return arrived when she saw a dingo exiting the tent, shaking its head vigorously as if it were carrying something heavy in its jaws. Lindy froze for a split second before she realized that the animal was not carrying a piece of food or a discarded shoe. She ran into the tent and found the bassinet empty, with only a small pool of blood visible on the surface of the canvas floor. She ran back out into the night and screamed that a dingo had taken her baby, her voice echoing off the silent walls of the rock. The logic of the search party was initially focused on tracking the animal through the scrub brush before the wind could cover the prints. Dozens of campers and park rangers spent the night scouring the base of Uluru with flashlights and floodlights, but they found no sign of the child. The police arrived the next morning and began a systematic investigation that would eventually turn from a search for a victim into a hunt for a perpetrator. They struggled to understand how a dingo could have unzipped a tent and carried a 9-pound baby away without leaving a more obvious trail. The public reaction to the disappearance was fueled by a growing suspicion of Lindy's calm and clinical demeanor during television interviews. In Australia, in 1980, the media expected a grieving mother to be hysterical and inconsolable at all times. Lindy's background as a nurse and her religious faith allowed her to speak about the loss with a level of detachment that many people found suspicious. Rumors began to circulate that the name Azaria meant sacrifice in the wilderness and that the parents had murdered their child as part of a ritual. The forensic investigation focused on the family's car, where a scientist claimed to have found traces of fetal hemoglobin under the dashboard and on the passenger seat. This evidence suggested that the baby had been murdered inside the vehicle rather than being taken by a wild animal. The police theory was that Lindy had cut her daughter's throat with a pair of nail scissors and then hidden the body in a camera bag. There were no witnesses and no murder weapon was ever recovered. Yet the scientific findings seemed to point toward a cold-blooded execution. Lindy was charged with murder, and her husband was charged as an accessory after the fact in a trial that became a national obsession. The prosecution argued that it was biologically impossible for a dingo to have committed such an act, and that the mother's story was a complete fabrication. The jury was presented with complex forensic maps and chemical analysis that appeared to show blood spatter consistent with a human attacker. In 1982, Lindy Chamberlain was sentenced to life in prison with hard labor, while her husband received a suspended sentence. She spent 3 years in a high-security prison, consistently maintaining her innocence while the rest of the country viewed her as a monster. She worked in the prison laundry and continued to record her thoughts in small notebooks, just as she had done during her camping trips. The case appeared to be closed, a dark chapter in Australian history that confirmed the dangers of the outback and the potential for human depravity. However, the scientific evidence that had convicted her was about to be re-evaluated by an entirely different branch of the government. The first major error in the investigation was revealed during an independent audit of the forensic findings from the family car. It was discovered that the substance identified as fetal hemoglobin was actually a sound-deadening compound used by the car manufacturer. The chemical spray used to reduce engine noise reacted with the testing agents in the same way that blood would, leading to a massive false positive. This meant that the primary physical evidence used to convict Lindy did not exist at all. The investigation then turned to the clothing that Azaria had been wearing on the night she disappeared. A young baby's matinee jacket had been missing from the initial items recovered by the police, a detail that the prosecution had used to argue that Lindy had hidden the evidence. The police claimed that if a dingo had taken the baby, the jacket would have been found near the other clothes. This piece of clothing became the center of a debate about the habits of wild animals versus the actions of a guilty mother. The twist in the case occurred in 1986, during the search for a missing hiker who had fallen from a ridge on Uluru. While searchers were combing the area near a known dingo lair, they found a small, weathered piece of white knit fabric partially buried in the red dirt. It was the missing matinee jacket that Azaria had been wearing on the night of the disappearance. The jacket was found exactly where it should have been if a predator had taken the child to its den to feed. This discovery changed the entire meaning of the previous 6 years of legal battles and public hatred. It proved that the mother had been telling the exact truth from the very first moment she ran out of the tent. The presence of the jacket in a dingo lair provided the physical evidence that the forensic scientists had claimed was impossible. The Australian government was forced to release Lindy from prison and open a new coronial inquest into the cause of death. The final verdict on the disappearance of Azaria Chamberlain was not officially recorded until 2012. After 4 separate inquests had been conducted, the coroner finally ruled that the child had indeed been taken and killed by a dingo, bringing a legal end to a 32-year saga. The case highlighted the extreme danger of relying on flawed forensic science and the power of public hysteria to override the facts. Lindy was eventually exonerated and received a formal apology and compensation for her wrongful imprisonment. The family car was eventually returned to the Chamberlains, its interior still stained with the chemical spray that had been mistaken for the blood of their child. Lindy continued to live her life with the same clinical precision she had always possessed, though she remained a polarizing figure to those who refused to accept the evidence. The yellow plastic bin and the notebooks from the trip were kept as artifacts of a life that had been interrupted by a nightmare. Some truths are so simple that people refuse to believe them until they are forced to see the evidence with their own eyes. The red monolith of Uluru still stands in the center of the desert, a place of immense beauty and a silent witness to what happened in 1980. The campsite where the tent once stood has been moved and reorganized, but the dingoes still move through the shadows at the edge of the light. Most tourists now follow strict safety warnings about the wildlife, a legacy of the tragedy that changed the way Australia views its own backyard. The silence of the outback remains as heavy as it was on the night the cry was heard. Lindy Chamberlain moved away from the spotlight and tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy for her surviving children. She lived with the knowledge that a nation had turned against her during her deepest moment of grief. She no longer cleans the dashboard of a car or prepares for camping trips in the red desert. The artifacts of her time in prison are stored away, and her name is no longer a headline. but a lesson in the fragility of justice. The sound of the wind across the desert floor is the only thing that remains unchanged since 1980. The dingoes are still there, sandy-colored ghosts that watch the travelers from the tall grass near the rock. People are taught to trust their eyes. But the Chamberlain case showed that the mind can see whatever it wants to see when it is afraid. Sometimes, the predator is exactly what it appears to be, and the monster is actually the crowd. Moving from the vast, open desert of Australia, we travel to the cold, sterile hallways of a nursing home in rural Norway. There, the threat was not a wild animal in the darkness, but a trusted professional who worked in the light of day. This person used their position of authority to decide who lived and who died, operating for years without a single person questioning their motives. The victims were not taken by force, but by a hand that was supposed to offer comfort. In early 1981, a nurse named Ingrid was walking through the heavy front doors of the Orkdal Valley nursing home in rural Norway. The air inside was cool and carried the sharp, sterile scent of floor wax and lemon disinfectant. She was 22 years old and had just completed her training, feeling a mixture of pride and nerves as she began her first professional shift. Her uniform was starched white, and her name tag was pinned perfectly straight on her lapel. Ingrid spent her first few hours learning the layout of the long, pale yellow corridors and the specific needs of the elderly residents. The facility was known for its high standard of care and its quiet, peaceful atmosphere. The windows looked out over the rolling hills and snow-covered forests of the Orkdal Valley. Most of the patients were in their 80s and spent their days sitting in the sunlit common room or resting in their private quarters. The director of the nursing home was a man named Arnfinn Nesset, who was highly respected by the staff and the local community. He was 45 years old and moved through the hallways with a quiet, efficient grace that suggested total control. Nesset was known for being deeply involved in the daily operations of the facility, often staying late to check on individual patients. He had a way of speaking in a soft, low voice that made both the staff and the residents feel heard. Ingrid noticed that the nursing home operated with a level of precision that she had not seen during her clinical rotations in the city. Every medication cart was perfectly organized, and every chart was updated with meticulous detail. There was a sense of order that felt comforting to a young nurse who was still finding her rhythm. She had a plan to work at Orkdal for 3 years while she saved enough money for a small apartment in Trondheim. She had a specific habit of counting the number of steps it took to walk from the nursing station to the furthest room in the West Wing. This small ritual helped her stay focused during the quiet hours of the night shift. She also kept a small notebook in her pocket where she wrote down the favorite stories of the residents she cared for. These details made the patients feel like more than just names on a medical chart. The first sign that something was unusual occurred during Ingrid's second week of work, when 3 residents died in the same night. This was a statistically high number for a facility of that size, even considering the advanced age of the patients. Ingrid watched as Arnfinn Nesset calmly signed the death certificates, listing the cause as natural heart failure. He spoke to the families with a gentle touch and a sad smile that seemed perfectly appropriate for the situation. Ingrid noticed that the residents who passed away had all appeared relatively stable just a few hours before their deaths. She remembered seeing one woman knitting a sweater in the afternoon, only to find her cold and still in her bed by midnight. She told herself that the elderly often fade quickly and that she was simply not yet accustomed to the reality of geriatric care. She focused on her duties and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease in the pit of her stomach. A few days later, Ingrid was clearing out a medical waste bin in the back of the pharmacy room when she found several empty vials. They were labeled as Curacet, a powerful muscle relaxant that was normally only used in surgical settings or intensive care units. She knew that Orkdal did not have a surgical ward, and there was no medical reason for such a drug to be present. She held the glass vial in her hand, the sunlight reflecting off the clear residue inside. The point of no return arrived when she brought the empty vials to the head nurse and asked why they were being used at the facility. The head nurse looked confused and stated that she had never ordered any Curacet for the residents. Ingrid realized that someone was bypassing the official supply chain to bring a dangerous substance into the nursing home. She looked down the long, quiet hallway and saw Arnfinn Nesset exiting a patient's room with his hands in his pockets. The logic of the facility began to feel like a mask for something much more clinical and calculated. Ingrid started to keep a secret log of every death and the presence of the director in the rooms during the preceding hours. She noticed that Nesset often volunteered to sit with the most vulnerable patients late at night when the rest of the staff was busy. He would tell the other nurses that he wanted to ensure they passed away with a familiar face nearby. The escalation of the situation drew the attention of a local journalist who had noticed a strange spike in the local obituary column. He began to ask questions about the number of deaths at Orkdal compared to other nursing homes in the region. The journalist contacted the police, who realized that not a single autopsy had been performed on any of the residents in over 4 years. Arnfinn Nesset had used his authority as director to sign off on every case without external review. The police conducted a quiet raid on the nursing home's administrative offices and discovered a massive discrepancy in the procurement records. They found that Nesset had personally ordered hundreds of vials of Curacet over the course of several years. When questioned, he initially claimed that he was using the drug to euthanize stray dogs in the area. However, the sheer volume of the muscle relaxant he had purchased made that explanation impossible to believe. The investigation became a national scandal as the police began the process of exhuming the bodies of several former residents. Forensic experts were looking for any trace of the drug, but Curacet is notoriously difficult to detect once the body has started to decompose. The case relied heavily on the paper trail of the drug orders and the testimony of nurses like Ingrid. The quiet nursing home in the valley was now the center of a criminal inquiry that spanned decades. During his initial interrogation, Arnfinn Nesset sat perfectly still and spoke in the same soft, low voice he used with the patients. He eventually confessed to the murder of 27 people, though he later retracted his statement and claimed he was under duress. He described how he would inject the drug into the intravenous lines or directly into the muscles of the elderly. He told the investigators that he enjoyed the feeling of total power he held over the lives of the residents. The nature of the drug, Curacet, was a critical part of the horror that had taken place at Orkdal. It does not cause unconsciousness or act as a sedative. Instead, it paralyzes every muscle in the body, including the lungs. The victims would have been fully aware of what was happening, but unable to move or breathe. They were trapped inside their own bodies, while their director watched them fade away in the silence of the night. This meant that Nesset was not acting as an angel of mercy who wanted to end the suffering of the elderly. He was a predator who chose a weapon that ensured his victims could never scream or fight back. He had turned a place of sanctuary into a hunting ground, where he could play the role of a god. The trust that the community had placed in him was the very thing that allowed him to operate for so long. The trial was the longest in Norwegian history and featured a man who appeared completely normal to the outside world. Nesset sat in the courtroom with a neutral expression, showing no emotion as the names of his victims were read aloud. The prosecution presented the evidence of his drug orders and the pattern of deaths that matched his shifts. In 1983, he was convicted of 22 murders and sentenced to 21 years in prison. Ingrid sat in the gallery of the courtroom, watching the man she had once respected as a mentor and a leader. She thought about the knit sweater she had seen and the quiet stories she had recorded in her notebook. She realized that the order and precision she had admired was just a method of concealment for a man who had no empathy. The yellow corridors of the nursing home would never feel peaceful to her again. The final verdict on Arnfinn Nesset was that he was Norway's most prolific serial killer. Yet he was sentenced under a system that valued rehabilitation over punishment. Because the maximum sentence at the time was 21 years, he was eventually eligible for release. He spent his time in prison, working in the library and maintaining a clean record, just as he had maintained the nursing home. He was a man who understood how to navigate the rules of any institution. In 2004, Arnfinn Nesset was released from prison and given a new identity by the government to protect him from public backlash. He moved to a different part of Norway and began living a quiet, anonymous life as a pensioner. The families of the 22 victims were left with the knowledge that the man who killed their loved ones was now a neighbor to someone else. He had served his time according to the law, but the void he left behind was permanent. The Orkdal Valley Nursing Home continued to operate, but it underwent a total overhaul of its administrative and medical protocols. New laws were passed in Norway to ensure that nursing home directors could no longer sign death certificates without independent verification. The facility was eventually renamed, and the old yellow paint was replaced with a more modern aesthetic. But for those who worked there in 1981, the memory of the Curasit vials remains. Ingrid eventually moved to Trondheim and found work in a large hospital where the oversight was much more rigorous. She never forgot the lessons she learned during those first few weeks in the valley. She became an advocate for patient safety and spent the rest of her career ensuring that no one else could operate in the shadows. The silver name tag she wore at Orkdal is kept in a small box at the back of her closet. The hills of the Orkdal Valley are still beautiful, and the snow still covers the pine forests every winter. The nursing home stands as a reminder that the most dangerous people are often the ones who appear the most reliable. We are taught to trust those in positions of authority, but the Nesset case showed that trust can be a fatal mistake. The hand that holds yours at the end should be a comfort, not a countdown. The story of the nursing home director is a cold chapter in a country that prides itself on its high level of social trust. It serves as a warning that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a professional doing his job. The silence of the hallway at night is now broken by more frequent checks and more eyes on the patients. But the ghosts of 1981 still linger in the stories of the families who never got to say goodbye. Moving from the clinical halls of a Norwegian nursing home, we travel to a courtroom in West Germany. There, the search for justice took a different, more immediate form. A mother was sitting in the gallery, watching the man who had taken her daughter's life. She was not waiting for a jury to decide the fate of the defendant. She had brought her own verdict, hidden inside a small leather purse, and she was ready to deliver it in front of the entire world. On a cold Friday morning in March 1981, a court reporter named Hans was sharpening 5 pencils to the same length at a small wooden desk in the district court of Lübeck. West Germany. The room was high-ceilinged and smelled of old paper and heavy lemon disinfectant. Hans was 52 years old and had spent 3 decades recording the testimonies of the city's most violent criminals for the official archives. He adjusted the tension on his typewriter and checked his supply of fresh ink ribbons before the session began. The courtroom was filled with the gray light of a northern German winter that filtered through tall, narrow windows along the eastern wall. Heavy oak benches creaked as the public gallery reached its full capacity of 60 people, many of whom had been waiting outside since dawn. Hans liked the predictable rhythm of the court, where every action was dictated by centuries of legal tradition. He kept a small glass of water at the corner of his desk and never allowed himself to look up once the typing began. The defendant, Klaus Grabowski, was a 35-year-old butcher with a history of sexual offenses who sat in the glass-enclosed dock. He looked bored and occasionally picked at a loose thread on his sweater while he whispered to his legal counsel. He was on trial for the murder of 7-year-old Anna Bachmeier, who had vanished from a local street months earlier. Grabowski had confessed to the killing, but he claimed that he was not fully responsible for his actions due to a hormonal imbalance. Marianne Bachmeier, the mother of the victim, was sitting in the 3rd row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table. She was 30 years old and operated a small Beau's, popular pub, in the center of the city, where she was known for her efficiency and her quiet nature. She was dressed in a dark coat and kept her blonde hair pulled back in a tight, professional bun that showed no loose strands. Hans noticed that she had not spoken to anyone or looked away from the defendant since the trial had started. Marianne's life before the murder was defined by the steady work of running her business and raising her young daughter in their small apartment. She spent her mornings ordering supplies for the pub and her afternoons walking Anna home from the local primary school. They had a plan to visit the Black Forest for a week-long holiday during the upcoming summer break. Marianne kept a framed photograph of Anna on the bar so she could see her daughter's smile while she served her regular customers. She had a specific habit of counting the daily earnings twice before placing them in a small metal safe in the basement of the pub. Her routine was a shield against the difficulties of being a single mother in a conservative and judgmental town. She was known as a strong woman who rarely asked for help and never allowed her personal emotions to interfere with her professional duties. These small details of her life were the foundation of a hard-won and fragile stability that she had built over many years. The first sign that something was different on that Friday was the way Marianne held her leather purse on her lap. Hans noticed that she was clutching the strap so tightly that the skin on her knuckles had turned white in the dim light. She did not look at the evidence, photos of the canal, or the maps showing the route where Anna had been taken. She kept her eyes fixed on the back of Klaus Grabowski's neck as he joked with his lawyer about a piece of paper. The testimony that morning was focused on the medical examiner's report regarding the physical injuries sustained by 7-year-old Anna. Grabowski sat with his arms crossed, showing no signs of remorse as the clinical details of the strangulation were read aloud for the jury. He had previously been chemically castrated for his crimes, but the procedure had been reversed just months before the murder took place. This fact was a point of intense anger for the residents of Lübeck who were following the proceedings in the papers. Hans was typing at a steady and rhythmic pace. His mind focused only on the technical language of the legal documents. He heard the sound of a zipper being pulled slowly in the gallery, directly behind his left shoulder. He assumed someone was reaching for a handkerchief to mask the tension that was building in the crowded and humid room. He did not turn around, as his job required him to maintain a constant and accurate stream of text for the court records. The point of no return arrived when Marianne Bachmeier stood up from her seat while the prosecutor was pausing to drink from a glass of water. She did not scream or make a scene, but instead moved with a calm and deliberate grace toward the center of the aisle. She reached into her open purse and pulled out a small, silver Beretta .22 caliber pistol. Hans stopped typing as the metallic click of the safety being disengaged echoed through the high-ceilinged hall and reached every ear. Marianne extended her arm and fired 8 shots into the back of Klaus Grabowski from a distance of less than 3 yards. The sound of the gunfire was sharp and muffled in the large room, followed immediately by the smell of burnt gunpowder and old dust. Grabowski slumped forward against the glass partition before sliding slowly to the floor among the scattered legal papers. The courtroom went perfectly silent as the thin trail of smoke drifted toward the wooden rafters above the judge's bench. Marianne remained standing with the pistol lowered at her side, her expression neutral and her breathing perfectly steady as she watched the floor. 2 police officers rushed toward her from the entrance, but she did not resist as they took the weapon from her hand. She reportedly looked at the body of her daughter's killer and said that she had done it for her, Anna. She was led out of the room in handcuffs, leaving Hans staring at the unfinished sentence on his typewriter. The legal logic of the case was immediately thrown into a state of total chaos that the district court was not prepared to handle that morning. A murder had been committed in front of a judge, a jury, and dozens of witnesses, including high-ranking police officials. The victim was a confessed child killer, and the perpetrator was a grieving mother who had become an instant national symbol. The investigation shifted from the death of Anna to the premeditation of the shooting by Marianne in the gallery. The police discovered that Marianne had not acted in a moment of sudden or uncontrollable emotional rage as the public initially believed. They found records showing that she had been visiting a local shooting range several times a week in the months leading up to the trial. She had spent hours practicing her aim with the same silver Beretta pistol she used in the courtroom. This meant the execution was a calculated act of vigilante justice rather than a spontaneous mental breakdown during the testimony. The public debate in West Germany was split between those who saw her as a hero and those who saw her as a threat to the state. Some citizens sent flowers to her prison cell and offered to pay for the best legal defense team in the country. Others argued that allowing a mother to commit an execution in a courtroom would lead to the total collapse of the judicial system. Marianne became known as the Mother of the Nation in the headlines of every major tabloid newspaper across Europe. During her own trial for the shooting, Marianne sat in the same dock where Klaus Grabowski had once sat and stared at her. She spoke in a quiet and firm voice about the failure of the government to protect her daughter from a repeat offender. She argued that the reversal of Grabowski's castration was proof that the system valued the criminal's rights over the safety of the innocent. Hans was there once again, recording every word of her defense for the permanent court records of the city. The twist in the story was revealed when a witness from the shooting range testified that Marianne had asked specifically where to aim to ensure a lethal shot. She had not wanted to wound Grabowski or cause him unnecessary pain. She wanted to ensure he never walked out of the courtroom alive. Every action she took from the moment of Anna's death was a step toward that final moment in the gallery. She had turned herself into a weapon of retribution with clinical efficiency and cold patience. This meant that the image of the impulsive and grieving mother was a mask for a focused and highly disciplined assassin. She had navigated the police investigation and the start of the trial with the singular goal of getting close enough to fire her weapon. She had even chosen the third day of the trial because she knew the security would be more relaxed by then. Her planning was as precise and cold as the medical examiner's report that had originally triggered her resolve to act. In 1983, Marianne Bachmeier was convicted of manslaughter and illegal possession of a firearm after a lengthy and heated trial. The judge sentenced her to 6 years in prison, a term that many in the public considered to be remarkably lenient. The court acknowledged the extreme provocation she had faced, but insisted that justice could not be served by a private individual. Marianne accepted the verdict without any emotion and began her sentence in a women's correctional facility shortly after. She served only 3 years of her sentence before being released for good behavior and due to the early signs of her declining health. She returned to her life as a pub owner in Lübeck. But the fame of the courtroom shooting followed her into every corner of her life. Tourists would often visit her bar just to see the woman who had fired the 8 shots into the butcher. She eventually sold the business and moved to a different city to find the privacy she had lost. Hans continued to work as a court reporter in the district court, but he never again saw a case that drew the same level of international attention. He kept a copy of the trial transcript from that Friday morning in a private file in his home office. He often thought about the sound of the zipper and the smell of the gunpowder that had filled the cold room. He realized that the law was a system of rules, but it was not always a system of peace for the victims. The final verdict on Marianne Bachmeier is that she forced a nation to confront the limits of its own judicial and medical systems. Her actions led to significant changes in German law regarding the supervision of repeat sexual offenders and the process of chemical castration. The public's overwhelming support for her showed a deep-seated lack of trust in the state's ability to protect children. She remained a polarizing and quiet figure until the day she passed away many years later. Marianne died of cancer in 1996 at the age of 46, just 15 years after the shooting in the courtroom. She was buried in a small cemetery in Lübeck next to her daughter, Anna, finally finding the silence she had sought for so long. The silver Beretta pistol is kept in a police museum, a cold and mechanical artifact of a mother's dark resolve. The courtroom was eventually renovated, but the memory of the '81 trial remained in the wood of the benches. The story of the Bachmeier execution is a reminder that the most dangerous person is someone who has already lost everything that mattered. It shows that the structure of a courtroom is only as strong as the people's belief in its ability to deliver justice. When that belief fails, the results are often as final and clinical as an 8-shot volley in a crowded hall. Some people do not wait for the scales of justice to balance. They tip the scales themselves. The investigation into Anna's death had revealed a series of systemic failures that had fueled Marianne's resolve to act on her own. Anna had left the house to go to a friend's home and was lured into Grabowski's apartment with the promise of seeing a new cat. He had kept her there for several hours before strangling her and disposing of her body in a cardboard box near the water. The police had previously been warned about Grabowski's presence in the neighborhood, but no action was taken. Grabowski had undergone chemical castration as a condition of a previous release, but he had petitioned the court to have the procedure reversed. He claimed that the hormones were affecting his physical health and that he was no longer a danger to anyone in the community. The medical board agreed with his request, and the treatments were stopped just 6 months before he targeted 7-year-old Anna. This information was released to the public during the trial, turning the entire community against the medical authorities. In the months before the shooting, Marianne had become a fixture in the local news. Always seen wearing black and refusing to speak to any reporters, she would walk from her pub to the cemetery every morning at 6 o'clock to lay fresh flowers on her daughter's grave. Her silence was interpreted by the public as deep grief, but it was actually the quiet focus of a person preparing for a specific task. She had sold her car and a portion of her business to raise the cash needed for the weapon. The third day of the trial was a Friday, and the courtroom was packed with more spectators and journalists than usual. The air was thick with the heat of dozens of people pressed together in the small gallery and along the wooden walls. Hans had noticed that the security guards were busy managing the crowd at the main entrance, leaving the interior of the room largely unmonitored. It was the perfect environment for a person who knew how to blend into the background and wait for her moment. After the 8th shot, the silence in the room was so absolute that the sound of the empty shell casings hitting the floor could be heard clearly. Hans watched as a small cloud of white smoke hung in the air above Marianne's head like a halo before it began to dissipate. She placed the pistol back into her leather purse and waited for the police to reach her in the center aisle. Her face showed no sign of the adrenaline or the fear that usually follows a violent act. The autopsy of Klaus Grabowski confirmed that 7 of the 8 shots had struck him in the back, piercing his heart and lungs with high accuracy. He had died almost instantly, never having a chance to turn around and see the person who was firing at him. The clinical precision of the wounds matched the reports that Marianne had practiced specifically for this result at the local range. There was no room for error in the execution she had planned for her daughter's killer. Moving from the focused violence of a mother in a German courtroom, we traveled to the rural landscapes of South Korea. There, a man of authority was moving between 5 different villages under the cover of a single night. He was not searching for a criminal. He was the one the people were hiding from in the darkness of their homes. The uniform he wore was a key that opened every door, leading to a night of chaos that the nation would never forget. On a warm evening in April 1982, an elderly man named Kim was sitting on the polished floor of his home in a small village in Uiryong County, South Korea. He was 74 years old and spent most of his days tending to a small patch of garlic and listening to the rhythmic chirping of the cicadas in the surrounding rice fields. The paradox of that night was that the very symbol of safety and order in the community was about to become the instrument of its total destruction. In the rural valleys of Gyeongsangnam-do, a police uniform was a key that could open any door without a single question being asked. By the time the sun rose the next morning, 56 people would be gone, and the quiet mountain air would be thick with the scent of gunpowder and betrayal. Welcome to the show. Tonight, we are looking at the deadliest non-terrorist spree killing in modern history. A tragedy that was fueled by a catastrophic failure of authority and a total abuse of public trust. We have reached the 9th story in our series of global accounts, focusing on a night when a small community was hunted by the person who was sworn to protect them. You might notice the sound of light rain falling in the background of this recording to help you settle in for the details. If you find these accounts compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel and let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Those who are most vulnerable often look toward the light of a patrol car for help, not realizing that the light can also be a lure for a predator. Before we get into the details of the Uiryong massacre, I have a quick favor to ask regarding the like button. Please invite the like button to join your neighborhood watch program and give them a very official-looking plastic badge and a high-visibility vest. When they show up for their first night shift, tell them that their only job is to stand perfectly still and guard a single-use tea bag sitting on a sidewalk. While they take their duty seriously, drive past them every hour and throw a handful of confetti out the window while screaming that the tea bag has been compromised. Now, let's get back to the night. A police officer named Wu Bumkan decided to turn his service weapon against his own neighbors. Kim lived in a house that had been in his family for 3 generations. A simple structure with a tiled roof and a courtyard that smelled of drying herbs and wood smoke. He was a man of habit, waking up at 5 o'clock every morning to check the irrigation ditches before the heat of the day settled over the valley. His village was one of 5 small clusters of homes that were connected by narrow dirt roads and a shared history of farming and communal support. Life in the county moved at a slow and predictable pace, governed by the seasons and the requirements of the land. He had a specific habit of drinking a small cup of rice wine every evening while he listened to the local news on a transistor radio that he kept on a wooden shelf. He was meticulous about his garden, often spending hours removing individual weeds with a small hand tool to ensure the garlic grew straight and strong. He had a plan to save enough money from the summer harvest to buy a new bicycle for his grandson, who lived in the city. These small, quiet ambitions were the foundation of a life that felt safe and permanent in the heart of the Korean countryside. The village was a place where no one ever thought to lock their doors. Even after the sun went down and the mountains turned into dark silhouettes against the sky, the air always carried a faint scent of pine needles and the damp earth of the rice paddies. In the evenings, the only light came from the scattered windows of the farmhouses and the soft glow of the lanterns used by the village elders. It was a high-trust society where the presence of a police officer was viewed with a mixture of respect and deep comfort. The first sign that something was wrong was a dull, thudding sound that echoed from the direction of the neighboring village of Torongmi. Kim paused with his cup of rice wine, thinking it might be a backfire from a tractor or perhaps someone setting off leftover fireworks from a local celebration. He checked the time on his wall clock and saw that it was just past 9:30 in the evening. He told himself that if there were any real trouble, the local authorities would have already alerted the community over the village loudspeakers. He noticed that the stray dogs in the courtyard had stopped barking and were now whimpering near the stone wall. A few minutes later, he heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the gravel path leading to his front door. He looked through the window and saw the familiar silhouette of a man wearing a dark blue police uniform and carrying a long rifle over his shoulder. The moonlight caught the silver badge on the officer's cap, providing a sense of immediate relief to the elderly man. The point of no return arrived when Kim stood up to open the door and welcome the officer into his home. He assumed the policeman was doing a routine check or perhaps looking for a place to rest after a long patrol in the hills. He did not know that the man outside was Wu Bumkan, a 27-year-old officer who had just stolen 2 M2 carbines and 7 hand grenades from the local armory. Wu had been drinking heavily after a domestic dispute and had decided to systematically eliminate everyone he encountered in the valley. Kim opened the door and greeted the officer with a polite bow, offering him a seat and a drink to help him through the night. Wu Bumkan did not say a word, but instead stepped into the small living room and looked around at the family photos on the wall. He moved with a stiff, mechanical gait that suggested he was operating under a singular and dark purpose. The elderly man noticed that the officer's eyes were bloodshot and his uniform was stained with what looked like dark oil or mud. The logic of the village was that an officer in uniform was a protector, so Kim did not feel fear, even when he saw the rifle being leveled at his chest. He believed there must be a misunderstanding, or that the officer was showing him a new piece of equipment. The betrayal of the uniform was a concept that the residents of Yuryong were not prepared to process in the heat of the moment. Wu Bumkan fired the first shot at close range, ending the life of the man who had just offered him hospitality. The officer then moved back out into the night, traveling from house to house with a clinical and terrifying efficiency. He would knock on the doors and wait for the residents to see his uniform before he opened fire. In some homes, He sat down and ate dinner with the families, pretending to be on a special mission to catch a criminal in the area. Once the families felt safe and relaxed, he would stand up and use his service weapons to ensure that no one could call for help. Wu Bumkan used his knowledge of the local geography to move between 5 different villages, cutting the telephone lines as he went. He knew that the communication in the rural county was fragile, and that it would take hours for word of the spree to reach the central station. He moved through the darkness like a ghost, appearing at the doors of people who had known him for months as a quiet and somewhat brooding officer. He used the hand grenades to destroy homes where the residents refused to open the doors or where he felt the need for a more abrupt end. The escalation of the spree continued for 8 hours, as Wu moved through the valleys with a supply of ammunition that seemed bottomless. He targeted entire families, including young children and the elderly, showing no signs of hesitation or remorse. The survivors described a man who didn't scream or shout, but instead moved with a cold and focused energy. He was a predator who had been given the keys to the fold and was now systematically culling the inhabitants. The police response to the massacre was a series of catastrophic delays and failures of leadership that allowed the killing to continue through the night. The local police chief was away at a meeting in a different city, and his subordinates were too afraid to mobilize without his direct orders. They spent hours debating the rules of engagement, while the reports of gunfire continued to pour in from the various villages. The officers who did arrive at the scene often stayed on the perimeter, unsure of how to deal with one of their own, who was heavily armed. This meant that the residents were left entirely on their own to face a trained killer who was utilizing military tactics and equipment. Some villagers tried to hide in the rice fields or the surrounding woods, but Wu used his flashlight to track their movements in the tall grass. He knew the hiding spots and the escape routes because he had patrolled them many times during his regular shifts. The landscape that had provided a living for the community for centuries had now become a maze with no exit. The investigation later revealed that Wu Bumkan had been struggling with deep feelings of inadequacy and professional failure before the night of the spree. He felt that he was being looked down upon by the villagers because of his outsider status and his volatile relationship with his girlfriend. The domestic dispute that triggered the event was a relatively minor argument about a fly that had landed on his chest while he was napping. This small, insignificant moment acted as the final crack in a psyche that was already under immense pressure. The twist in the case was that the very thing the villagers relied on for their survival was what led to their deaths. People didn't run away from the sound of the gunfire. They ran toward the man in the blue uniform, thinking he was the one stopping the violence. They sought shelter in his presence, only to find that the source of the danger was the badge itself. The total subversion of the protective role of the police was a trauma that would scar the national consciousness of South Korea for generations. In the early morning hours, Wu Bumkan realized that he was running out of ammunition and that the military was finally closing in on his position. He retreated to a final farmhouse and took several hostages, including an entire family who had been hiding in their basement. He sat with them in the dark for several hours, reportedly speaking about his frustrations and his desire for a clean end to the night. As the sun began to rise over the mountains, he pulled the pins on his final 2 hand grenades and held them close to his chest. The explosion ended the life of the officer and several of his final victims, bringing a violent and abrupt conclusion to the 8-hour massacre. The final count of 56 dead made it the deadliest spree killing by a single individual in the world at that time. The village of Wuyang was left in a state of total shock, with every family having lost multiple members to the man they had once called their neighbor. The physical damage to the homes was repaired, but the psychological damage to the trust of the community was permanent. The final verdict on the Uryong massacre was a massive overhaul of the South Korean police force and the resignation of the Minister of Home Affairs. The government was forced to admit that the failure to respond to the crisis was a national disgrace that could not be ignored. New protocols were established for the storage of firearms and the psychological screening of officers before they were given positions of authority. The tragedy served as a cold reminder that the uniform is only as honorable as the person wearing it. the village elder. Kim was buried in the small cemetery overlooking the rice fields where he had spent his entire life. His grandson never received the bicycle he had been saving for, and the garden of garlic was eventually reclaimed by the weeds. The transistor radio remained on the wooden shelf, a silent witness to a night when the news was brought by a man with a gun. The high-trust culture of the rural valleys was replaced by a new, more cautious way of living. Today, there is a small memorial in Uriang County that lists the names of the 56 victims of the 1982 spree. It is a quiet place where people come to leave flowers and remember the families that were lost in the darkness. The local police station has been rebuilt, and the officers are now required to undergo much more rigorous training and oversight. But for the survivors, the sound of a knock at the door late at night still brings a moment of hesitation. The story of Wu Bumkan is a reminder that the most dangerous person is often the one who has been given the power to rule over others without accountability. It shows that the structure of society depends on the integrity of those who maintain the peace. When that integrity fails, the result is a nightmare that no amount of protocol can fully prevent. Some shadows are cast not by the absence of light, but by the very things we use to illuminate our world. Moving from the violent betrayal in the Korean countryside, we traveled to the quiet lanes of rural England. There, the threat was not a man in a uniform, but a silence that swallowed a young girl in the middle of a sunny afternoon. This disappearance happened in a matter of seconds, leaving behind only a bicycle with its wheels still spinning. The mystery would remain a frozen moment in time, a void that no amount of searching could ever fill. On a warm Saturday afternoon in August 1978, 13-year-old Jeanette Tate was riding her bicycle down a narrow country lane in Aylesbury, Devon. She was doing something as mundane as delivering newspapers to her neighbors, a task she had completed hundreds of times before. The paradox of the afternoon was that in a stretch of road, only 100 yards long, a human being could simply stop existing in the middle of a sentence. It took less than 60 seconds for a busy country lane to turn into a complete vacuum of evidence. This specific window of time was so small that it defied the logic of a typical kidnapping or accident. Jeanette was a girl who lived by the clock and the requirements of her paper route. Yet she vanished during the brightest part of a summer day. There was no scream, no sound of a struggle, and no witness who saw her being taken. The only thing left behind was a physical trail that stopped dead in the center of the road. Welcome to the final story of this batch. Tonight we are looking at the ultimate frozen moment disappearance, a case that has haunted the United Kingdom for nearly 50 years. We have 10 stories in this collection, and this one represents the most terrifying type of mystery, where there is no struggle and no sound. Please notice the sound of the rain in this recording to help you focus on the details of the Devon countryside. If you find these accounts insightful, feel free to subscribe and share what time you are listening to this. Before we get to the lane in Aylesbury, I have a quick request regarding the like button. Please take the like button out for a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek in a massive, quote, empty warehouse. Tell them you will count to 100. But instead of counting, just leave the building and go get a very long lunch at a diner across town. When you return 3 hours later, find them still hiding behind a crate and tell them they are actually the seeker now. Now, let us get back to the moment the wheels of a bicycle were still spinning in the dirt. At 3:15 on the afternoon of August 19th, a 13-year-old girl named Sarah was pedaling her bike through the tall hedges of Withen Lane. She was trying to catch up to her friend, Jeanette Tate, who was just ahead of her on the newspaper route. The air was thick with the scent of dry grass and the sweet smell of honeysuckle that grew along the old stone walls. Sarah liked the way the sunlight flickered through the leaves of the oak trees as she rode. Jeanette was a cheerful girl with long dark hair who was wearing a white sweater and light blue trousers that afternoon. She carried a heavy canvas bag over her shoulder that was filled with copies of the Exeter Express and Echo. She had a specific habit of folding each newspaper into a tight rectangle before sliding it through the brass mail slots of the local cottages. Her movements were practiced and efficient, a result of months spent working the same 4-mile loop. Sarah and another friend had been chatting with Jeanette just a few minutes earlier at the entrance to the lane. They were talking about the upcoming school term and a new record that had just been released by a popular band. Jeanette seemed to be in high spirits, laughing at a joke about a local teacher as she checked the strap on her newspaper bag. She had a plan to finish her route by 4 o'clock so she could meet her father for a walk in the woods. The friends watched as Jeanette turned her bike onto a straight stretch of the road that was bordered by high, thick hedges on both sides. The lane was so narrow that 2 cars could barely pass each other, creating a sense of privacy and safety. Sarah stayed behind for a moment to adjust the chain on her own bicycle, which had been clicking since they left the village. She could hear the soft whirring of Jeanette's tires on the pavement as she moved further away. The afternoon was typical of a late summer day in Devon. With the temperature holding at a comfortable 70 degrees, the only other sounds were the distant hum of a tractor in a far field and the occasional chirp of a blackbird in the trees. Sarah finished with her bike chain and stood up, wiping the grease from her fingers onto a tuft of grass. She looked down the long, straight lane to see how far Jeanette had gotten. She noticed that the road ahead was completely empty of any movement or color. The white sweater and the bright blue bicycle were no longer visible against the dark green of the hedges. Sarah assumed that Jeanette had simply pedaled faster than usual or had already turned the corner at the end of the straightaway. She hopped back on her bike and began to ride quickly, wanting to catch up before the next set of houses. Sarah rounded the slight bend in the road just 60 seconds after she had last seen her friend. She expected to see Jeanette standing at a gate or perhaps waiting for her near the intersection. Instead, she saw a sight that caused her to squeeze her handbrake so hard that her tires skidded on the asphalt. Jeanette's bicycle was lying on its side in the very center of the lane, its frame resting in the dust. The first sign that something was deeply wrong was the fact that the wheels of the bicycle were still spinning in the air. The newspaper bag was still draped over the handlebars, and several copies of the Exeter paper were scattered across the ground. There were no skid marks on the road, and no sign that a car had stopped or accelerated quickly. It looked as if Jeanette had simply evaporated while she was in motion. Sarah called out her friend's name, her voice sounding thin and small in the sudden silence of the countryside. She walked to the edge of the hedge and looked through the gaps in the branches, expecting to see Jeanette playing a prank. She told herself that her friend had likely dropped something and had climbed over the wall to retrieve it. She waited for a laugh or a familiar face to appear, but the only response was the rustling of the leaves. The point of no return arrived when Sarah realized that the spinning wheels had finally come to a complete stop. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural, making the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She knew that Jeanette would never leave her bike and her papers in the middle of the road unless something had forced her to. She turned her bike around and rode back toward the village as fast as her legs would carry her. The logic of the search party was initially focused on the idea that Jeanette had been involved in a hit-and-run accident. Her father and several neighbors arrived at the lane within 10 minutes, searching the deep ditches for any sign of a body. They found nothing but the empty bicycle and the scattered newspapers, which were still crisp and dry. The police arrived shortly after and cordoned off the lane, treating the area like a crime scene for the first time. The search for Jeanette Tate became the largest missing persons investigation in the history of the Devon and Cornwall police. Thousands of volunteers joined with officers to comb through every field, woods, and outbuilding within a 10-mile radius of Aylesbury. Divers were sent into the local ponds, and the police used heat-seeking technology from helicopters to scan the ground. Despite the massive scale of the effort, not a single piece of clothing or personal item was ever recovered. The investigation into the disappearance looked into every vehicle that had been seen in the area that afternoon. Witnesses reported a white van and a maroon sedan driving near the lane around 3:30, but neither could be identified. The police interviewed hundreds of people, searching for anyone with a history of violence or suspicious behavior. They struggled to understand how a person could be taken from a narrow road in a 1-minute window without anyone seeing the perpetrator. Sarah spent the following weeks sitting in her room, replaying that 60-second gap in her mind over and over again. She remembered the sound of the birds and the smell of the honeysuckle, trying to find a detail she might have missed. She wondered if the shadow of a passing car had crossed her path, or if she had heard a door slam in the distance. The memory remained a series of static images that offered no clues and no comfort. The escalation of the case reached a national level as the media began to refer to Jeanette as the girl who vanished into thin air. Her parents appeared on television every night, pleading for information and offering a reward for her safe return. The sense of security in rural England was shattered, as parents across the country stopped letting their children play outside alone. The lane in Aylesbury became a site of pilgrimage for those who wanted to leave flowers and prayers. The first major break in the case did not come until the mid-1980s, during the investigation of a serial killer named Robert Black. Black was a van driver who specialized in the abduction and murder of young girls across the United Kingdom and Europe. Investigators discovered that his delivery route often took him through the county of Devon during the late 1970s. They began to look for a link between his movements and the afternoon Jeanette disappeared from Withan Lane. The police found that Robert Black had a history of using the high hedges and narrow roads of rural areas to trap his victims. His method involved stopping his van in the middle of the road to block the path of a child on a bicycle. He would then snatch the victim and pull them into the back of the vehicle before anyone else could round the corner. This theory perfectly matched the 1-minute window and the lack of a struggle found at the scene in Aylesbury. This meant that the disappearance was not a mystery of physics or a glitch in reality, but a matter of cold, predatory timing. Robert Black had likely been sitting in his van just around the bend, waiting for a target to enter the straight stretch of the road. He had timed his move to the second, knowing exactly how long he had before the next person would appear. The silence of the lane was not an accident. It was a professional requirement of a killer. The twist in the case was that, although the police were convinced of Black's guilt, they could never find the evidence to charge him. He was a man who took his secrets to the grave, refusing to confess to the murder of Jeanette Tate, even when he was facing a life sentence for other crimes. This left the family with a suspect but no body and no final resolution to the mystery. The case remained an open wound in the archives of Scotland Yard. In 2016, Robert Black died in prison, effectively ending any hope of a legal conviction or a discovery of Jeanette's remains. The police officially concluded that he was the most likely perpetrator, but the file could never be closed with a verdict of solved. The disappearance remains a frozen moment in time for the residents of Aylesbury who still remember the girl in the white sweater. The bicycle with the spinning wheels is the only image that persists. The final verdict on the disappearance of Jeanette Tate is that the most dangerous weapon in a kidnapping is a stopwatch. The predator did not need a complicated plan. He only needed 60 seconds of isolation and a road with no exits. The innocence of a rural paper route was used as a hunting ground by a man who understood the rhythms of the countryside. Some people do not leave a trail because they are taken by someone who knows how to erase one. Sarah still lives in the region, but she no longer rides her bicycle down narrow lanes when the sun is beginning to set. She looks at the high hedges and sees not a boundary of safety, but a wall that hides the view of the road ahead. The sound of a white van on a quiet street is something that still causes her to pause and look over her shoulder. The memory of the spinning wheel is a clock that never stopped ticking for her. The lane in Devon is still there, looking almost exactly as it did in 1978. The oak trees are taller and the stone walls are covered in more moss. But the geography of the disappearance is unchanged. Most people who drive through the area have no idea that a girl once vanished from the center of the road. But for those who know the history, the silence of Withan Lane is a cold and heavy thing. Jeanette Tate's parents eventually passed away without ever knowing what happened to their daughter or where her body was hidden. They lived their lives in a state of permanent waiting, keeping her bedroom exactly as she had left it on that Saturday afternoon. The newspapers she was supposed to deliver were eventually thrown away. but the story they contained became a part of the local lore. Some secrets are kept by the earth itself, buried beneath the roots of the hedges. The story of the girl on the bicycle is a reminder that the most familiar settings can turn into a nightmare in the blink of an eye. It shows that our sense of security is often based on the assumption that someone is always watching. When that assumption fails for even 1 minute, the results can last for a lifetime. The frozen moment in Aylesbury is a void that can never be filled by the passage of time. This concludes the first batch of stories from the early 1980s, covering a period of global unrest and private shadows. We have traveled from the corporate battles of Japan to the basements of Argentina and the lanes of rural England. Each case has shown that the threats we face are often as diverse as the landscapes we inhabit. Thank you for listening to these accounts and for joining me in this exploration of the dark corners of history. We have spent the last several hours walking through the darkest corridors of human history, looking at cases that redefine our understanding of safety. From the moonlit hills of Tuscany to the crowded streets of Osaka, the recurring theme is that the world is far more fragile than we care to admit. These accounts are not just chronicles of death, but studies in how quickly a life can be dismantled. We look into the abyss not to be consumed by it, but to recognize the shapes that live there. As your narrator, I approach these stories with a specific lens that prioritizes the physical reality of the victims over the abstract theories of the investigators. My message is simple: the greatest threats do not always arrive with a warning or a dramatic flourish. Often, they come with a soft knock at the door or a familiar smile across a dining table. I aim to strip away the sensationalism, to show you the clinical mechanics of how a tragedy actually unfolds in real time. It is important to note that while these stories are based on rigorous research of court records and police files, some elements have been fictionalized. To place you directly in the scene, I reconstruct sensory details like the smell of a warehouse or the specific thoughts of a victim in their final moments. This dramatization serves to bridge the gap between a cold report and the lived experience of the people involved. We use the tools of storytelling to make the truth feel heavy. One of the most chilling lessons from the Glico-Morinaga case is that power can be seized through psychological manipulation rather than physical violence. The monster with 21 faces proved that a giant corporation is only as strong as the public's trust in its products. By threatening the candy supply of an entire nation, they showed that the modern world is interconnected in ways that make us all vulnerable. They didn't want the gold as much as they wanted the chaos. In the case of the monster of Florence, we see the failure of forensic science when it is obstructed by systemic corruption and secret societies. The precision of the crime suggested a level of skill that the authorities were unwilling to fully investigate among their own social circles. This case teaches us that justice is often a matter of geography and social standing. If a killer is useful to the powerful, the truth might remain buried in the woods forever, regardless of the evidence. The story of Petit Gregory in France highlights the devastating power of a community that chooses silence over the truth. The crow was not a stranger from the outside, but a voice from within the family tree, fueled by decades of petty jealousy and inherited hatred. This teaches us that the people who know us best are often the ones who know exactly where to strike. A village can harbor a monster for 40 years if the secret is woven into the fabric of its daily survival. Woo Bum Khan's rampage in South Korea is perhaps the ultimate warning about the danger of blind trust in a uniform. We are taught to look for the badge as a beacon of safety, but in Yuryong, that badge was a master key to 56 homes. This case forces us to confront the fact that authority is a double-edged sword. When the person sworn to protect you becomes the predator, there is no psychological defense prepared to handle that level of total betrayal in the dark. Lindy Chamberlain's experience in Australia serves as a sobering lesson in the cruelty of the crowd and the fallibility of forensic experts. A grieving mother was turned into a national villain because her emotional response did not match the expectations of the media. This case shows how easily a narrative can be manufactured from thin air when the public is hungry for a monster. We must learn to distinguish between a person's actual guilt and our discomfort with their faith. Arnfinn Nesset in Norway reminds us that the most dangerous killers are those who operate within high-trust institutions like nursing homes or hospitals. He used his position as a director to hide his crimes in plain sight, knowing that no one would question a death in a place meant for dying. The lesson here is that oversight is not a lack of trust, but a requirement for safety. Without transparency, a sanctuary can easily be turned into a clinical hunting ground. Marianne Bachmeier's courtroom execution in West Germany brings up the complex moral dilemma of vigilante justice. When a mother sees the legal system failing to protect her child and punishing the perpetrator with leniency, the urge to intervene becomes a physical force. This case teaches us that the law is a fragile agreement that only works if people believe it is effective. If the state cannot provide justice, the victims will eventually find a way to deliver it alone. The clan Puccio in Argentina illustrates the concept of the banality of evil in its most literal form. A family could eat dinner and do their homework while a human being was being tortured 10 feet below their chairs. This teaches us that evil does not require a dark cave. It only requires a domestic routine and a lack of empathy. We must recognize that some of the most horrific crimes are committed by people who look entirely normal to their neighbors and their friends. Jeanette Tate's disappearance in rural England is a study in the terrifying speed of a criminal act. It took less than 60 seconds for a girl to vanish from a straight road with no side exits. This case reminds us that a predator does not need a complex plan if they have perfect timing and a lack of conscience. The frozen moment in the lane teaches us that our safety is often a matter of seconds. We are only as secure as the window between our presence and the next. The Matamoros cult in Mexico shows the power of a charismatic leader to manipulate others through fear and supernatural promises. Adolfo Constanzo convinced hardened drug runners that human sacrifice would make them bulletproof, a lie that they believed until the very end. This case teaches us that the human mind is capable of incredible self-deception when it is offered a shortcut to power. A belief system can be more dangerous than any weapon in the hands of a madman. Looking back at these 10 accounts, the narrator's message becomes clear. We must pay attention to the small details that feel slightly out of place. Whether it is a white van in a country lane or a nursing home director who stays too late, the warnings are almost always there. We tell these stories not to keep you awake at night, but to sharpen your instincts for the world around you. Knowledge of the darkness is the only way to ensure that you remain in the light. My perspective is that we owe it to the victims to look at the facts of their cases without the filter of comfort or convenience. Often, the official story is designed to protect an institution or a political reputation, rather than the truth of what happened in that warehouse or that basement. By focusing on the clinical mechanics of the crimes, we honor the reality of their experience. We refuse to let their names become just another statistic in a dusty police file. The role of fictionalization in these scripts is a deliberate choice to enhance the psychological tension of the narrative. By describing the specific scent of the air or the rhythm of a character's breathing, I am inviting you to stand in their shoes for a moment. This is not meant to replace the facts, but to provide the emotional weight that a dry police report lacks. The drama is a tool for engagement, ensuring the lessons are etched into your memory forever. Throughout this batch, we have seen how the legal systems of different nations respond to the same fundamental types of evil. Whether in the high-tech offices of Japan or the rugged outback of Australia, the struggle between order and chaos remains the same. Each culture produces its own specific version of a monster. Yet the motivations of greed, power, and revenge are universal. These stories are a map of the condition, showing us the highest levels of loyalty. One recurring theme is the failure of communication between those who see a problem and those who have the power to fix it. In the cases of both the Glico-Morinaga and the Matamoros cult, early warnings were ignored or dismissed by those in authority. This teaches us that the first person to see the cracks in the wall is rarely the person who is believed. We must foster a culture where the concerns of the individual are taken seriously, especially regarding safety. The physical artifacts left behind in these stories serve as cold witnesses to the events that unfolded. A silver Beretta, a cream-colored Fiat, or a single newspaper bag tell a story that words sometimes cannot fully capture. They are the tangible links to a past that many would rather forget, yet they remain as evidence of the truth. These objects remind us that the darkness is not just a concept, but something that has a weight and a shape in the physical world. As we close this chapter of the investigation, I want to emphasize that the true victims are the families who are left behind in the wake of the violence. The people of Lepanges, the Chamberlains, and the parents of Jeanette Tate all lived in a state of permanent waiting for a resolution that often never came. The collateral damage of a crime is a wave that ripples through generations, changing the lives of people who were never even at the scene of the actual crime. The final lesson is that we must never take our sense of security for granted, as it is a luxury that can be taken away in a single minute. The stories we have shared are a testament to the resilience of those who survived and a memorial to those who did not. My message remains focused on the power of observation and the necessity of questioning the status quo. In a world of shadows, the person who is most aware is the one who has the best chance of reaching the dawn. In the next batch, we will continue our journey through the late 80s, looking at cases that push the boundaries of law even further. We will see the rise of new forensic techniques and the emergence of crimes that were shaped by the technology of the era. The narrator will continue to be your guide through these difficult accounts, maintaining the same clinical and precise tone. The shadows are long, but we will walk through them together, one step at a time. Twist: you have been listening to these accounts from the safety of your own home, believing that the victims were targeted because of their specific circumstances or bad luck. But the truth hidden in the data is that in over 60% of these cases, the predator did not choose the person. They simply chose the first door that was left unlocked. While you were focused on the monsters in the stories, you forgot to check the one shadow currently standing behind you.